I'd like to welcome you to the second preeminent tutorial today. The second one is on the topic of neural networks. And our presenter today is Professor John Donahoe of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. John received his PhD from the University of Kentucky in 1958 and has been a prominent figure in the experimental analysis of behavior since that time. John is most closely identified with a selectionist approach to learning, a position that he has developed in two important learning textbooks, one with Michael Wessels and a more recent one with David Palmer. And also he's developed this point of view in a number of research and theoretical articles in SQAB and in other behavioral journals. In a 1989 book review of a book on parallel distributed processing that was edited by McClellan, Rumelhart, and a mysterious entity called the PDP group, John first showed SQAB's readers the connection, if you'll pardon the pun, between selectionism and neural networks. And he suggested in that same review, he suggested a number of other interesting relations between parallel distributed processing and topics of interest to people in the experimental analysis of behavior. He's going to talk today about neural networks, and without further ado, I will turn the stage over to John.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is an overview of what I want to talk with you about today. The major message is that neural networks are tools of interpretation. Interpretation in Skinner's sense of the term. As we'll see, Skinner talked about two aspects of science, two interdependent aspects of science. One is the experimental analysis of behavior, and the other is the use of principles based upon the experimental analysis to try to understand behavior in situations that themselves cannot be subjected to experimental analysis. Now, neural networks are concerned with filling in the gap, as it were, between the environmental inputs to the organism and the behavioral outputs. And that has always been a problematic concern for people in behavior analysis. And so I want to spend a little time describing exactly what kind of role they play, and in particular Skinner's views of these kinds of things. Now, I said that a tool of interpretation is a way of examining the implications of basic principles. And the core principle in the experimental analysis of behavior is the nature of reinforcement. How does reinforcement work? And so I want to talk about what we know from experimental analysis about reinforcement, both at the behavioral level and at the level of neuroscience. And then I'll go on and talk about a number of different interpretations that use neural networks to try to explore the implications of basic principles. And finally, just a few comments on what I think the future will look like. Now, before we get into the details of these topics, a word or two about neural networks. As behavior analysts, and I certainly count myself as one, we are interested in environmental events and their effects on the organism. So we're interested in inputs and outputs. Now, these inputs could represent either some molar event like a tone coming on or a light coming on, or they might be much more constrained by physiology. For example, one might have a neural network in which one modeled what goes on in the retina. But for our purposes, we're going to treat these as stimuli defined in the way that behavior analysts define stimuli. The outputs of the network that we're going to be concerned with are operant behavior, which is symbolized here by R, and responses that are elicited by unconditioned stimuli, or more generally by reinforcers. And the thing that makes this formulation differ from the behavior analytic is that we supplement the input and output information with units, neuron-like units, that mediate between the inputs and the outputs. And so what neural networks do is to add to the environment-behavior relations that are investigated in the experimental analysis of behavior something about the intervening events that mediate the observed environmental behavior relations that we study. Now, some people, when I've talked about this sort of stuff, feel that the concern with neural networks is not in the spirit of behavior analysis. But I think they're very much in the spirit. And here are some statements from Skinner. The first statement makes it clear that Skinner sees the analysis of behavior as a part of biology. And this is something that distinguishes what behavior analysts do from what psychologists do. And secondly, Skinner is clear that if you're going to talk about what intervenes between environmental inputs and behavioral outputs, then what you do must be informed by what he called brain sciences, or neuroscience more generally. So I think a concern with neural networks, not as a replacement of, but as a supplement to the experimental analysis of behavior, is very clearly sanctioned and, in fact, endorsed in behavior analysis by Skinner. As I mentioned earlier, there are two complementary aspects of behavior analysis, of the analysis of behavior. One is experimental analysis. Now, what happens in experimental analysis is you devise very often artificial environments in which you can control very tightly the stimuli that are presented to the organism, and you measure very exactly the behaviors that occur in the presence of that environment. Now, no experiment is a perfect experiment. You can't control all stimuli. You can't measure all relevant behavior. But certainly we can talk about a range of experimental conditions in which the control over inputs and outputs is quite precise. And those are the conditions under which one identifies the basic processes and from which one derives the basic principles that are used to try to understand behavior in situations where this cannot be done. And that's what interpretation is concerned with. Interpretation attempts to get those principles, to trace out their implications, to see if the principles are powerful enough to provide an accommodation of the behavior that is observed under circumstances that cannot be subjected to experimental analysis. And this is just a statement from Skinner to indicate the clear distinction that he saw between them. And I'll just read this with you. Much of the argument goes beyond the established facts. I am concerned with interpretation rather than prediction and control. Skinner would make statements like this when he was, particularly when he was talking about things like verbal behavior. As our knowledge is limited by accessibility, not by the nature of facts. What he's talking about here is that in the world that cannot be subjected to experimental analysis, the very same processes are going on as in those circumstances that can be subjected to experimental analysis. It's not a different kind of thing. It's not something else that's happening, but rather what is happening under circumstances in which one cannot meet the requirements of an experimental analysis. That is to say, control the inputs, measure all the relevant outputs. As in other sciences, we often lack the information necessary for prediction and control and must be satisfied with interpretation. But our interpretations will have the support of the prediction and control which have been possible under other conditions. Newton didn't do an experimental analysis of the tides. Newton's accounts of the tides is an interpretation. We cannot predict or control human behavior in daily life with the precision obtained in the laboratory, but we can nevertheless use results from the laboratory to interpret behavior elsewhere. Now, this orientation here, this separation between the conditions under which basic processes are identified and the conditions under which one uses those processes to try to explain events in the real world is not peculiar to behavior analysis. This is what all sciences do. Now, because psychology in general doesn't recognize the importance and fundamental character of the analysis-interpretation distinction, most of psychology is attempting to carry out experimental analyses in circumstances in which the conditions required for experimental analysis cannot be made. So this just summarizes the points that I've been making. Through experimental analysis, where you have tightly controlled environmental conditions, and you measure the relevant effects of those on behavior, you identify basic processes, and then you try to formulate principles, that is to say, rules, verbal behavior, that will capture those processes. Then on the basis of those principles, one engages in a process of interpretation, and that's what I'm going to argue is the role of neural networks, interpretation, and try to then give accounts of complex phenomena that occur outside of the laboratory in which the demands of experimental analysis cannot be met. Now, as an example of the fact that this circumstance is not peculiar to behavior analysis, let's consider the parallel between behavior analysis and evolutionary biology. In evolutionary biology, certain basic principles are identified, such as natural selection. Then in the new synthesis or modern synthesis in evolutionary biology, the mechanisms that implement this functional state principle, natural selection, those mechanisms were identified, genetics. And then population genetics was used as a way of interpreting what had been identified through experimental analysis. And the result is we can provide an account of complex structure. Now, in the case of behavior analysis, behavioral principles are identified, and the key one is reinforcement. And then, if you're going to engage in an interpretation that makes use of and appeals to intervening events, then one must base those on principles that come from neuroscience. Now, in order to give an account of complex behavior requires interpretation, and neural networks are at least one of the means that are available to provide an interpretation. So from this point of view, neural networks have the same functional role with respect to the accounts of complex behavior that population genetics had in the case of evolution through natural selection. Now, this view of how one goes about accounting for complicated things is not shared in general in psychology. And this is an oversimplification, as any attempt to describe the history of ideas in a single figure must be. But I think it's useful to regard that when science broke off from philosophy, there are sort of two paths that it took. One is the path of the natural sciences. The other, though, is the path influenced primarily by the British associationists that are what I call inferred process theories. What happens in inferred process theories is one makes observations and then uses those observations to try to infer the underlying events of which those observed events are the result. And that's what psychology does. Psychology, by and large, is inferred process theory. If you're a social psychologist, you try to make inferences about attitudes. If you're a cognitive psychologist, you try to make inferences about memory. If you're a clinical psychologist, maybe you make inferences about ego structures or whatever. And psychology, in associationism, cognitivism, and in something that you hear about occasionally these days, theoretical behaviorism, are all examples of inferred process theories. Now, this is a very different situation from this branch here, the branch that broke off into physics and then biology and then moving into behavior analysis. The behavior analysis traces itself back to biology through Pavlov, explicitly stated so by Skinner. And so behavior analysis and psychology are two different kinds of things. Now, you might have made an argument at one point that, well, a neuroscience was not available to tell us what are the events that intervene between inputs and outputs. And therefore, since we're curious about those, maybe all we can do is make conjectures about them. Now, this is a sort of pragmatic justification for an inferred process theory. But that situation doesn't exist anymore. So even if the pragmatic argument had some force, which I don't believe that it did, the basis for that argument has been undermined by the existence of a neuroscience. Now, there are still reservations that people have about this sort of thing. Skinner believed that if you were going to try to fill in the gaps between environment and behavior, you had to talk about it in terms of brain science, that behavioral observations would never be sufficient, that behavioral observations, whatever the neuromechanisms were, those mechanisms must be consistent with the behavioral observations, but that one could not know the intervening events from the observations of behavior alone. There simply was a one-to-many relationship between the behavior and the intervening events. Now, sometimes we mistakenly think when we look back in the history of science, well, look at the wonderful guess that X made, and isn't that just about some event which was later shown to be the case? Isn't that a justification for inferred process theories? But that's a spurious argument, because it neglects the fact that for every X that ended up being right, there was an infinite number of other X's that ended up being wrong. And it's only standing here and seeing the X's that have endured into the present that misleads us into thinking that this really was a very useful kind of enterprise. Okay, even given that if you're going to fill in the gaps, you must do it through neuroscience, what are some kind of reservations that behavior analysts might have? First of all, many behavior analysts would say it's not necessary to fill in the gaps. Why do we need to get involved with what intervenes between environmental events and behavioral events? And the answer is, you don't need to for many purposes. A person who's doing applied behavior analysis, a person who's doing experimental behavior analysis, very often does not need to get into what's going on in between. I would argue that for the ultimate success of behavior analysis as an approach to understanding human behavior, that it is necessary to get into it. If you take a look at the Darwinian case as an example, Darwin's arguments were not effective even with the majority of biologists until the mechanism was discovered whereby natural selection could have worked. There will, however, be occasionally phenomena that cannot be understood on the basis of behavioral observations alone. And so there will occasionally be circumstances in which it will be necessary, after the variance at the behavioral level has been exhausted, it will be necessary to get involved in the intervening events. But certainly, most of behavior analysis does not need to be concerned with intervening events. Some people believe that if you get involved with neuroscience, that this somehow undermines the independence of behavior analysis, that it diminishes it, that it makes it something other than an independent science. This seems to me to be a really misunderstanding of what it means to provide scientific explanations. Does the physiologist feel that he must give up his discipline because he gets interested in the biochemistry that underlies, let's say, the action potentials that he measures? Does the person who's doing molecular biology feel that he doesn't have a science because he ultimately encounters situations in which he has to appeal to principles that have been identified by physics? No, not at all. Science is a continuous, provides a continuous account. All the sciences should talk and draw upon one another. And I think the argument here probably stems from, in the initial periods of the formulation of behavior analysis, it was very important to try to argue that it was an independent science, that there was something worthwhile in studying behavior at the level of behavior and for its own sake. But that was a sort of political motivation. And, but the scientific motivation for it seems to point towards the direction of continuities. And finally, there's the issue of a conceptual nervous system. Aren't neural networks introducing a conceptual nervous system in Skinner's sense? And I think the answer to that is as follows. In psychology, most neural networks are conceptual nervous systems. But the kind of neural networks that are of interest to me and I would think to behavior analysts generally, are those that are constrained and informed by independent experimental analysis in neuroscience. Now, there's a sense in which no neural network will ever capture the complete richness of a nervous system. But Skinner's admonitions about levels of analysis seem to apply equally well here. Skinner argued that we make observations to the point that orderly relations emerge. And if we add additional information, no explanatory variance is gained. And I would argue that the same sort of guideline applies here. We make use of that amount of neuroscience that is minimally necessary to provide an account of the complex behavior that we're interested in. Now, how much that is will probably depend on the phenomenon we're dealing with. But the only thing that we must not do is to ever talk about any characteristic of a neural network that is inconsistent with the known facts from neuroscience. What I'd like to do now is to move to the second part of the presentation, and that is to a discussion of reinforcement. And the position that we're taking here is the one that I've indicated several times, that any principle of reinforcement must be consistent with both the experimental analysis of behavior and the experimental analysis of neuroscience. Behavior analysis tries to identify fundamental parsimonious environment-behavior relations, as few as possible, in order to provide an account. And neuroscience then attempts to identify the neural processes that fill the gap between the environments and the behaviors that are measured by the experimental analysis of behavior. Now, there are several impediments to this enterprise. And one of the most fundamental ones is the distinction between operant and respondent conditioning procedures. I've written about this in conjunction with a number of people over the years. I'm not going to belabor it here. But I would say this is maybe the basic insight. How likely is it that natural selection would come up with one set of processes that just happens to map onto what Pavlov studied in his laboratory, and another set of processes that just happen to map on what Thorndike and Skinner studied in their laboratories? It seems to me vanishingly small, particularly if you can show that the same conditioning process can accommodate the results from both Pavlov's laboratory and from Thorndike and Skinner's laboratory. If you can show that a single principle can accommodate the results of both procedures, then a great responsibility falls on those who would argue for different kinds of conditioning processes as to how in the world evolution would come up with them. And so I've taken the view that there probably is one conditioning process, and it has different realizations in Pavlov's procedure and in the operant procedure. Now, the defining difference, operationally, between Pavlov's procedure and the operant procedure is the relation of the event with the unconditioned stimulus or reinforcer. Pavlov, as you know, studied the relationship between what happens when environmental stimuli vary in their relation to some stimuli that already elicit behavior. For example, tone, food pairings. Whereas the operant procedure, in the simplest realization, varied the relationship between some other kind of event, behavioral event, a response, not the operant, and the unconditioned stimulus, such as lever press food arrangement. Now, food is food, whether it appears in Pavlov's procedure or in the Thorndike-Skinner procedure. The food doesn't know what kind of procedure it's in. The animal's nervous system probably doesn't know, have a priori knowledge of the procedure that it's in. And so it seems to me that if you could show that a single principle of selection by reinforcement were competent to produce the different behavioral outcomes in Pavlovian and operant conditioning, that kind of principle would probably be what you're looking for. Now, in behavior analysis, the distinction between elicited behavior and emitted behavior is a very fundamental one. And again, I'm not going to go through what we've talked about in our writings about this. The basic message, though, I would say the take-home message is this. All of the distinctions, the critically important distinctions that Skinner identified between respondent conditioning and operant conditioning procedures can be accommodated by a single principle of reinforcement. Skinner's distinctions endure. Skinner's distinctions remain absolutely important. These procedures have very, very different kinds of outcomes. And the approach that I'm going to talk about today does not in any way diminish. In fact, it reinforces. I shouldn't use the term in two senses. It strengthens the importance of the distinctions that Skinner made. But it does so without talking about different kinds of conditioning processes. Now, in the field of quotes learning, the dominant view there are the view of associationists. And they've gotten these differences in procedure. The unconditioned stimulus is dependent upon a stimulus in Pavlov's case and a response in the operant case. And they have glorified these or enshrined them as indicating different kinds of associations are formed in the two procedures. So that, for example, in the Pavlovian procedure, in the simplest case at least, stimulus-reinforcer associations are formed. Whereas in the operant case, another kind of association, a response-reinforcer association, has developed. What I want to do today is to try to undermine both of these. And the first insight is this. There's certainly an operational distinction between the Pavlovian and the operant procedure. Operational distinctions are necessary for experimental analysis. But they're not sufficient. In other words, any experimental analysis is going to have to meet the test of an operational definition. But not all distinctions that meet that test are worthy of being enshrined in science. And so let's re-examine the Pavlovian procedure. In the Pavlovian procedure, there's an environmental event called the conditioned stimulus, and it is typically presented prior to some unconditioned stimulus, like food that elicits some response like salivation. And in discussing these results, because the experimenter manipulates the relation between this stimulus and this stimulus, there has been the great temptation to describe the results as being fundamentally due to the relation between these two events, two stimuli. But the thing to note, though, is this, that when you manipulate the relation between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, you also change the relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. In other words, from an operational point of view, you are manipulating the relation between the CS and the US/UR. And it's not clear which of those relationships is fundamental if one is and the other is not. The point is that in the Pavlovian procedure, one could, on the basis of just the operational, talk as much about the CS-UR relation as one could talk about the CS-US relation. The standard procedure does not allow you to distinguish between those. So in order to try to reassess whether or not it's useful to talk about Pavlovian conditioning in terms of the relation between two stimuli, we tried to devise an experimental procedure that allows us to experimentally analyze whether it's the CS-US relation or the CS-UR relation that's important. If it's the CS-UR relation that's important, this undermines the importance of the operational distinction between Pavlovian conditioning and operant conditioning. Now, what do you need to do in order to experimentally separate the differences between CS-US relations and CS-UR relations? Well, you can do it if you have an unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response of long latency and long duration. Because what does this allow you to do? This allows you to institute two procedures that differentially vary the relationship between the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response. Now, this first procedure I call a forward CS-UR procedure. Notice the CS is coming on before the unconditioned response. Notice, however, the CS is coming on after the unconditioned response. Now, normally those things are confounded. If the CS comes on before the US, it must necessarily also come on before the UR. But if you're dealing with a response that has an appreciable latency, you can implement a condition that has not been examined, namely one where the CS-UR relation is forward, but the CS-US relation is backward. And finally, you can institute a procedure called a backward CS-UR procedure. Notice here the CS is coming on after the US, after the UR, but it is contiguous with, it's overlapping with the UR. So if you have an experimental preparation in which the unconditioned stimulus elicits a longer latency, long duration response, you can examine some conditions that allow you to unconfound CS-US from CS-UR relations. Now, in order to do that, there are several preparations that could be used, but the one that we used was one that we had developed in which we have a pigeon that's restrained. We inject water into the pigeon's mouth, and we measure essentially the tongue movements that are elicited by injecting water into the mouth. The tongue is affixed to the base of the throat, and the throat moves, and you can pick up these little movements. Now, it turns out that the latency of these little tongue movements after the unconditioned stimulus is presented is much longer than it is in standard conditioning preparations. Now, you're going to laugh when you hear how long it is. It's about 225 milliseconds. But the latency of, for example, the nictitating membrane response after you give a puff of air into the rabbit's eye is maybe 10 to 50 milliseconds. You can't do anything with that experimentally. But this does allow you to examine some of these conditions. And let me show you the results of an experiment. And there are two measures that you can use: the percentage of trials on which there is a throat movement response and the rate of throat movement responses. And today, I'll only talk about this and with a general comment about this one. So let's examine just the top graph. This first set of bars refers to a standard forward CS-US relation. This is the case where the conditioned stimulus comes on before both the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. In other words, this is more like the standard Pavlovian conditioning. And what it shows is that the level of responding increases relative to a proper control procedure. So conditioning does occur with this preparation. Nothing surprising there. These two conditions here are the ones that are of interest. The forward CS-UR procedure is one in which the CS comes on after the US, but before the UR. In these particular cases, what would happen is water would be squirted into the pigeon's mouth, and then a visual CS would come on, and then the pigeon would start making tongue movements. And as you can see, conditioning occurs under those circumstances. The CS-US relation is backwards, but the CS-UR relation is forward. Now let's look at the backward CS-UR procedure. This is the one in which water gets squirted into the bird's mouth, the bird starts to make tongue movements, and then the visual CS comes on, and it stays on while the bird is making a bout of throat movements that are elicited. Conditioning does not occur under those circumstances. The critical temporal relation appears to be the relation between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response evoked by the unconditioned stimulus. So in other words, when you can unconfound the CS-US and the CS-UR relations, conditioning tracks the CS-UR relation, not the CS-US relation. As long as the CS comes on before the UR, you get conditioning, whether or not the CS comes before or after the unconditioned stimulus. There are other ways to try to investigate this. This is another procedure. This procedure is called the CS-UR overlap procedure. Notice what we have here are 3 CS's, each of which begin the same amount of time before the unconditioned response. So the CS-UR relation is constant. Where they differ, though, is in the degree of overlap between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Here's a very small amount of overlap, a moderate amount of overlap, and extensive overlap. If the overlap between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response is important, then we would expect conditioning perhaps to improve as the overlap increases. Now, what do we know about the effects of extending the CS in circumstances in which the unconditioned response is a very short latency, very brief response, like the nictitating membrane of the rabbit? Well, that's been studied. And the effect of it is it weakens conditioning. So we know that when you're dealing with a brief unconditioned response, that extending the CS past the onset of the unconditioned stimulus weakens conditioning. But if it's the CS-UR relationship that's important, extending the CS past the US simply increases the overlap between the CS and the UR, which might improve conditioning, which is exactly what happens. When there's minimal overlap, you get this amount of conditioning, and now with the same amount of CS-US relation, the same interstimulus interval, you get this much, and now with an increase, you get even more. And we did an experiment in which we did a within-subjects manipulation of the same variable by getting a group and training it with little overlap and then switching it to a moderate overlap, and we also got the result. So the basic idea then is increasing the overlap between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response improves conditioning. And the reason the earlier literature shows that extending the CS past the US weakens conditioning is because in the earlier literature they used unconditioned stimuli that evoke very brief responses. Well, as you might imagine, the people that do classical conditioning are not too thrilled with these results. Because what these results say is that the operational distinction between Pavlovian and operant conditioning may not be the standard operational one, may not be the best one to talk about in terms of trying to understand what's going on. It may be the relation between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. And I don't have the time here, but there are a lot of data that are of other sorts that are consistent with this kind of idea. So some of them have made the suggestion, well, maybe there's some lingering water in the bird's esophagus, and that there's still a CS-US relation present. And therefore, even though you've shown conditioning under these circumstances, it's still the CS-US relation, but it's the US that's left over in the esophagus that is doing the job. Now, this argument is compelling, but at a great price. Because to make that argument, you have to argue that it is impossible to distinguish the unconditioned stimulus from the unconditioned response. Because wherever you have one, you must necessarily have the other. And so it really undermines the importance of the distinction they're trying to preserve, namely that it's the CS-US relation that's important. There are other problems with it as well. But the question arises experimentally, how can you do an experiment that eliminates this possible alternative interpretation? Well, it turns out that there's an older literature that shows that rats will drink an airstream. Thirsty rats will drink an airstream. Now, This isn't surprising because a stream of air into the mouth provides many of the same tactile stimulation and much the same temperature stimulation as a jet of water. And so we did an experiment in which we blew air into the pigeon's mouth. In this experiment, these results are preliminary, but they show exactly the same result. Now, to argue that there's lingering air in the esophagus seems, if that's if that's the next defensive point, then I'm afraid that I'm not interested in attacking the position anymore. The point is that if you give an animal a 50 millisecond puff of air into its mouth, it engages in a bout of tongue movements. And you can show that you can do conditioning under those circumstances, and that an increase in the amount of overlap between the CS and the UR causes an improvement in conditioning. Now, as I say, this study is in progress, but these differences are of a magnitude which has always been reliable if preserved in our other work. Well, given these sets of results, then, it appears that the operational distinction between the Pavlovian and operant conditioning in terms of one's a stimulus relation and one's a response-stimulus relation can be deeply questioned. And so we've proposed a principle of reinforcement on the behavioral level that says this: whenever a behavioral discrepancy occurs, that is, whenever a reinforcer evokes a change in behavior, then whichever stimuli are present come to guide whichever responses are present. It's a really stupid principle. It's so stupid it might even be right. David Hull, talking about natural selection, said, it's such a simple idea anyone can misunderstand it. And it could very well be that this principle will provide considerable leverage on trying to understand conditioning. Now, the outcome of this process will be very different in the Pavlovian procedure as opposed to the operant procedure. What are the stimuli that are apt to be present in the Pavlovian procedure? The conditioned stimulus. What are the responses that are apt to be present? The unconditioned response, which in its conditioned form is called a conditioned response. Now let's take the operant procedure. What are the stimuli that are apt to be present? Well, whichever stimuli were present just before the response occurred. This might be some explicit discriminative stimulus. Let's say a tone comes on when bar pressing produces food. Or it could simply be the sight of the bar as the animal presses it. Notice the only difference between the Pavlovian procedure and the operant procedure is the operant itself now bears the proper time relationship to be captured by the conditioning process. In other words, from this point of view, operant conditioning is fundamentally superstitious, as Skinner himself speculated in his first paper on superstition. In other words, the same conditioning mechanism just happens to catch the operant response because the procedure guarantees that it's going to be around when the conditioning process gets turned on. So the differences between the outcomes of Pavlovian and the operant procedures can be captured without having a difference in principle necessarily. Now, how about on the neural level? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the basic idea is this. Whenever a neural discrepancy occurs, then whichever presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons are coactive, the synaptic efficacies between them will increase. Now, what is a neural discrepancy? Well, as I'm using the term here, reinforcers, environmentally presented reinforcers, are stimuli that increase the rate of firings of dopaminergic neurons in a particular portion of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area. When dopamine gets squirted out into synapses between coactive pre- and postsynaptic neurons, it's been shown through work in the dish that there will be an increase in synaptic efficacies. And the dopamine is necessary for this to happen. Dopamine is sufficient for this to happen. Now, let me just give you one observation that illustrates what I'm talking about. This is a work done by Wolfram Schultz. Here's the first trial of a conditioning experiment in which a sound is being paired with a liquid reward. This is when the sound comes on. This is when the liquid reward comes on. And what we're doing is we're looking at the firing of neurons in the ventral tegmental area. And you can see that on the first trial, shortly after the liquid reward has been presented, there's a burst of firing in those neurons. Now let's give the animal a series of conditioning trials in which we pair the sound and the reinforcer together. Now notice what happens. Now when the sound comes on, there's a burst of firing in the dopaminergic neurons. And when the liquid reinforcer is presented, if anything, there's an inhibition in their firing. Okay? So what has happened as a result of conditioning is you have removed the ability of that liquid to function as a reinforcer in that environment. And I won't go into it in detail, but this is the basis of the phenomenon, behavioral phenomenon of blocking. Well, these are some of the facts that we have tried to accommodate in our neural network models. And this is an example of the kind of neural network that we're going to be working with in its most pared down form. Let's do it this way. Here we have the input units that we had before, the output units that we had before, the intervening units that we had before, and we've added on to that the reinforcing system. This is an input unit that is activated by a reinforcer. When that input unit is activated, it stimulates the ventral tegmental area. Now these blue areas here represent the non-specific projections, dopaminergic projections of the ventral tegmental area into the motor association cortex and motor nuclei generally. So the basic idea then is this. Let's suppose this unit here is active. Let's suppose this unit here is active. And let's suppose a reinforcer is presented. Well, now we meet the conditions required for an increase in the synaptic efficacy between these two neurons. We have a presynaptic neuron that's active, a postsynaptic neuron that's active, and dopamine is being squirted out into that synapse. And so the next trial, if this interneuron happens to be activated, it will have a higher probability of activating the operant. And this is going on throughout the system. Notice a system like this would be able to exploit an increase in brain size because you don't need to have specific connections going to the right places in order to make use of an increased brain size. All you have to have are these non-specific systems, these blue systems, growing out as the brain grows, and you can then utilize the new brain tissue. Now this part of the system over here has to do with changes in what might be called perceptual responses. And I'm not going to talk about them here, except as to say this. First of all, this is an area of the hippocampus. It projects diffusely or non-specifically to the sensory association cortex, just like the ventral tegmental area projects to the motor systems. Notice also that there is an input from the ventral tegmental area into into the hippocampus. This arrow should be blue. So this means that there's a possibility of coordination of, you might say, perceptual learning with motor learning. And I just want to mention that just to indicate that we have also been concerned on the perceptual side, although that's not what we're going to be talking about today. Now this scheme that I've just described can be seen as an instance of what appears to be a quite general evolutionary strategy. And that is that you can get a mechanism in which specific effects emerge from a non-specific mechanism acting over time. And natural selection, selection by reinforcement, and this also occurs on the cellular level. Just very briefly, when the nucleus makes the proteins that are necessary to bring about changes in the structure of receptors, those proteins migrate diffusely down to the dendrite, and there are molecular tags that are placed on those synapses that have recently been active. And that allows the mechanism to be specific, even though you might say the reinforcing effect of these proteins is very general. Well, let's take a look and see how this system does with a number of different conditioning phenomena. And because of time, you're going to have to take my word on some of these. Would I lie to you? Don't answer that. This mechanism, if you get networks of this sort and you simulate a Pavlovian procedure, they learn what organisms learn in Pavlovian conditioning. And if you simulate with the very same network, with the very same reinforcement rules, you get the results that you get in operant conditioning. Extinction, reacquisition after operant conditioning, conditioned reinforcement, discrimination formation. For those of you that are contextualists, this system is also very contextualist. A stimulus, a discriminative stimulus presented out of context may not have the ability to control the response in some other context. And I'll spend my time talking about two more recent simulations that may be of interest. One of them has to do with timing, which is one of the things that will be discussed later on in this meeting. Here's an example of a neural network that has been exposed to contingencies like those of fixed interval schedules. There is no external stimulus to tell the network what time it is. But you'll notice that, and these lines represent when the reinforcer occurs. And you'll notice that pauses develop after reinforcement. What happens here is the action of reinforcement on this network selects a set of connection weights, and connection weights are the counterpart of synaptic efficacies. It selects a set of connection weights such that it takes prolonged exposure to the environment before the network will emit the operant response. And you can get some sense of that here. Here's a particularly long pause, right? Well, let's take here. Here's a particularly short pause. So there's a lot of opportunity for extinction. All these responses here weren't reinforced. And notice the next interval has a considerable pause in it. And you get this kind of dynamic going back and forth between acquisition and extinction. The last phenomenon I want to mention is a phenomenon that is this response reinforcer relation. Here we have exactly the same network that we had before, and we've added only one connection. This connection, a recurrent connection, causes this unit to be activated when the reinforcer occurs. In other words, this allows, speaking loosely now, the network to know when it's making or about to make the conditioned response. There's plenty of evidence for the existence of such connections. Here's an example of the results of such a simulation. Let's take a look at just this one here. Each of these are different organisms, but they tell the same story. Here's the strength of responding with that connection intact. Now we get that connection and we reset it to its initial value, and responding goes down. In other words, responses, operant responses, do come under the control of feedback from activity in the respondent system. And the same system produces both effects. And let me finish up, this is the last, by saying that I think that the future prospects for trying to give a very deep understanding of human behavior is almost upon us. But what it requires is an integration of behavior analysis with neuroscience. and then the development of sophisticated tools for interpretation like neural networks. Okay, that's all, but I would be remiss, and greatly remiss, if I didn't indicate the names of some of the people that have worked with me on this project. Dave Palmer and Phil Chase, I've had long discussions with them on interpretation. The experimental analysis of CSUR relations, Rocio Vegas, and here's some of the other people that I've worked with. And then on neural network interpretations, primarily Jose Burgos, but sort of standing in the wings, keeping us from going too far off, is David Palmer. Okay, thank you.